In the name of Allah, who is the most merciful and the most beneficent. Assalamu alaikum to all the students. I am your instructor Noshaba Faraz for the course title American Literature, and its code is ENGL 4128. This presentation aimed to identify the trace of modernism in Hemingway's work The Sun Also Rises. As far as Hemingway is concerned, in France he was considered a modernist because of his style alone. And some American scholars, however, argue that Hemingway is not a modernist but rather a realist. And after going through this presentation, we might be able to know that what does it mean to call Hemingway a realist writer? Is his practice of realism compatible with modernism, as well as are modernism and realism two overlapping movements? Before we start discussion regarding the modernism and The Sun Also Rises, we would like to have a look what actually this modernism is. Modernism is in its broadest definition modern thought, character or practice. More specifically, the term describes the modernist movement, its set of cultural tendencies and array of associated cultural movements, originally arising from wide-scale and far-reaching changes to Western society in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, simply we may infer that modernism it was a predominantly European movement, and it began in the early 20th century, and it was characterized by a self-conscious break with traditional aesthetic forms. It actually represented the radical shift in cultural sensibilities surrounding World War I. And modernist literature, it struggled with the new realm of subject matter brought about by an increasingly industrialized and globalized world. Dear students, here are some of the characteristics of modern literature. They are mentioned over here, like spiritual disillusionment. And this disillusionment we may take either the shape of the nihilism or the search for the enduring values and absolutes, and all this happened just because of the World War I. And then psychological depth mean the themes or the ideas they all had been related to the psychology of the people, that they had been passing through the very difficult time, and they were very confused, and they were feeling loss and annihilation, and as well as the feeling of we may say disappointment. And focus on perspective, stream of consciousness, it was used by the writers at that time. Thickening of style mean the style, it was quite complex and difficult and experimental. The authors and the writers, they used to and just follow the new experiments in the writing styles, in the writing methods, and emphasis on the symbolism. Symbolism was used in order to have the deep meanings in the writings. Self-consciousness, and self-consciousness, actually it was a salient feature of the modernism, and it led towards the more experimentation, and through it the people, they might be able to know the meaning of their own being or their own existence. And avant-garde, this was also the work of the painters, the writers, the musicians, and it gained very much importance during that time, because it highlighted the ideas and the styles and the methods. They were quite original and modern in comparison to the period in which the people had been living. And now we would like to find out whether in The Sun Also Rises we might be able to have such characteristics of modern literature or no. Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises is a story that can be discussed as a modernist novel. As Jeffrey Mears inscribes that the novel is recognized as Hemingway's greatest work, and we may consider The Sun Also Rises as a modernist novel on the first striking feature, that is the level of the style which was used by Hemingway. He uses short declarative sentences. He might be considered as a master of the dialogue, because He did not use the words like charmingly, smilingly, hesitatingly, angrily. They are completely missing in his writing style. And they are replaced by one simple word. And this simple word, it is said. He doesn't use qualifiers, and there are very few adjectives and adverbs which are used in his style of the writing. He uses colloquial American speech. And this style was actually a revolt against the 19th century romanticism, in which there were verbiage, romantic allusions, a great deal of description or a description of false sentiments. And the famous Hemingway style emerged as a reply to the crash of values after the First World War on the English literary scene. Hemingway's fame is won largely by the simplicity of his style. Hemingway is the bronze gold of the whole contemporary literary experience in America. His stories give a sense of life as chaotic as experience itself. Life is not arranged in self-contained episodes. And the readers, they just get greatly impressed with Hemingway's strict regard for integrity in everything. And never does he accept beliefs because they are long-lived. Rather, he tests them according to his own experience. His scrupulous honesty has resulted in an original technique which has gained for him an inviolable position not only in the literature of his own country but also as an influential figure in international literature. We can take the iceberg theory at the level of the style. It is easy to classify Hemingway as a modernist. And if we talk about his iceberg theory, it is what is visible on the surface is only about 1/8 of the totality of the experience that is being represented. And about his iceberg theory, it is said that he is of the view, I always try to write on the principle of the iceberg. There is 7/8 of it underwater for every part that shows. Basically, this means saying less to suggest more. Hemingway, he believed that the essential was the only element that needed to be on the paper. The underlying meanings was the work of the reader, his imagination and his own interpretation. At first glance, the reader generally does not see what is beneath the lines. He needs to reread the story to discover the layers of the meaning. And so it becomes quite a striking feature of his own writing that gives the readers a chance that they may interpret according to their own perceptions. Hemingway plots, they are extremely simple, and we just come to know that there are almost one or two major figures. And the novels mostly they deal with their ordeals, their disappointments, their frustrations and their struggle to achieve some measure of dignity. And it usually happens that his novels, they usually end at a point where they begin. Because when, as in this novel, we come to know that Jack Barney's love for Brett Ashley cannot be consummated because of his physical injury. So we may come to know that at the start of the novel they had been quite frustrated, and at the end of the novel they are still frustrated. And the few complications they are introduced, they are usually resolved. And we may say that the method in order to to find out the resolution to such problems is over there, that they just want to have some spiritual development of the character. So here the reader, he just remains interested to know how the main character resolves a certain conflict and overcomes a certain obstacle, but the end seems to be predetermined. The realistic efforts of the late 19th century saw writers exactly shows life and its difficulties, and realists made an effort to give a complete image of modern life by giving the perfect portrait. They did not effort to give one view of the life, but instead made an effort to demonstration the different classes, behaviors, and stratifications of life in America. Realists shaped this portrait of America by uniting a wide variety of the details derived from observation and certification to approach the norm of the experience. Accompanied by the method, realists match the objective or absolute existence in America to that of the universal truths or observed facts of life. So we will be able to know that the life of that time, it is quite realistically portrayed in the novel, and it relates the lives of the people who belong to the different stratas of the life. They might be the matadors, they might be the soldiers, they might be the expatriates. So we may be able to know that the life is portrayed over here very realistically, and not only one view of the life is given over here, but instead of that the author, he just tried to bring the different classes. He showed their different behaviors and the stratifications of the life which had been in that time in America. It is beautifully portrayed. After the World War I, American people, they were alienated. The war reduced the individual identity and the society altogether. The human personality was dwarfed as much by the dehumanizing magnitude of modern events as by natural laws that controlled man to their own destiny. Authors felt World War I created a new literature of enduring merit that shattered conventional taboos in their expression of physical and psychological actuality. So what happened that after World War I, androgyny became a symbol of the modern condition. So too do the characters of the novel take on the allegorical roles. Despite these roles, the men and women who inhabit the sun also rises are remarkably complex characters who bring to life questions of how the most basic parts of an individual's nature may be altered by war and loss, and they embody the shifts in gender roles that were exhibited in real life throughout 1920s and reinforce the significance of modern problems such as the expiration of traditional notions of masculinity and femininity and the uncertainty of the human nature. Hemingway uses images, and these images symbolize the particular ideas and concepts. He uses the images of death, darkness and disorder, war or the violent encounter, bad nerves, insomnia, despair, etc., etc. And how do we infer what does this death symbolizes? We may say that the death, it symbolizes the great nada, which is inevitable and ever present. Actually, it just gives us a sense that this life, it is meaningless. There is nothing. And if we talk about darkness and disorder, these symbolize the chaos, unknowability and hostility of the universe. War or the violent encounter symbolize the hostility of life and the ever-presence of pain and death. Bad nerves, we may infer that this symbolizes the fear, anxiety, loss of control, which the recognition of nada brings in anybody's life. There is insomnia. So insomnia, actually, it is a kind of symptomatic of the fear of nada, a symbol of the man's attempt to, as well as his inability to stop thinking about nada. Then here is the despair. Despair, it might be the absence of hope and confidence, with the recognition of nada tempts man towards and against which man must struggle. Some more images are used by Hemingway's, which are kind of the images, and they have underlying ideas and themes and concepts related to them, as the unreasonable wound, the unreasonable death, the unreasonable loss, and bad luck. And which kind of motives do they propagate? The unreasonable wound, actually it signifies the unexpected and irrational injury, and it symbolizes the irrational hostility of life and of the ever-presence of destruction and death. As far as the unreasonable death is concerned, it is just like the unexpected and irrational injury, and it is also symbolizes the ever-presence of the destruction, but its focuses on the death. And what about the unreasonable loss? It is just like the ever-presence of the destruction, but its focus is on a wound which results in the permanent loss of an ability or on the death of a loved ones. And as far as bad luck is concerned, it is a negative perception, it is often hostile and destructive presence of chance and accident. Hemingway in his primary works portrays the life of two types of the people. One type consisted of the people depressed by the First World War, one of faith in the moral principles in which they had believed and who lived with cynical disrespect for anything but their own emotional needs. Just like the protagonist of the novel. And there is also other types who were the men of simple personality and simple emotions, such as bullfighters and prize fighters. And Hemingway wrote of their brave and usually futile battles against environments just like the Kohan. In post-World War I Europe, a group of the expatriates who were the refugees, who were the people who had been to the exiles, they wanders about the Basque country trying to find meaning in life. And Hemingway's characters in The Sun Also Rises are much like the people with whom he came into daily contact in Paris in the early 1920s, a large group of expatriates labeled by Stein the lost generation, lived by their wits, by what jobs they could find or by handouts from home. So it is with the characters in Hemingway's novel. And if we just relate it to The Sun Also Rises, we just come to know that The Sun Also Rises portrays a few American and British young men whose experiences of the war are qualitatively not different from those of the Nick Adams and Jake Barnes, and they are lost in a world which they do not understand. They seek solace in drink and sex and in an endless round of the merry-making, and their meaningless wanderings in Paris and later in Pamplona are the equivalents of their confused minds, which have failed to find any guiding principle in life. And in this situation, bullfighting for them becomes a symbol of life, in which the matador demonstrates how a man facing death can retain their dignity. So the people had been living the meaningless lives, but they wanted to find out the meaning by getting indulged in the activities of their own interest. Hemingway made the words "The Lost Generation" famous by prominently displaying them on the title cover of The Sun Also Rises. And it is also said that Gertrude Stein had used these words by saying, "You're all a lost generation." Hemingway had reacted to this particular definition by saying that they were as solid as any other generation, and the words "lost generation" were a piece of high bombast. And so this term "lost generation" is generally applied to those who had actively participated in the First World War, and as a consequence of this had realized that life was meaningless. And it was the first time that soldiers and generals alike had come to realize that they were helpless in the hands of the destructive weapons that they were using, and the machines which had become their masters instead of being their slaves. It made them realize that they are quite extremely helpless, and they were victims of a vast conspiracy in which machines and gods had conspired to strangle the individual's freedom. As a main theme of the novel, The Sun Also Rises can be referred to the lost generation's aimlessness and male insecurity. So the motive is the failure of communication and incorrect friendships. Hemingway's combination of the two epigraphs produces an indecisive tone. On the one hand, there is hopefulness because there will be a new generation after the purposeless generation that inhabits The Sun Also Rises. On the other hand, there is unpleasant irony since each generation is lost in the sense that every generation will finally die. Hemingway's individual inquests for reality were straight connected. About it, Earl Rowitt point out more often than not. Hemingway's fiction seemed rooted in his journeys into himself much more clearly and obsessively than is usually the case with major fiction writers. His writing was his way of approaching his identity, of discovering himself in the projected metaphors of his experience. He believed that if he could see himself clear and whole, his vision might be useful to others who also lived in this world. And this had been quite a modern approach. As he just tells about us, it might be an autobiographical element as well, that he just shared that if you have you have got this approach to find your own identity, then it will become very clear for you in order to know about other people who are around you. And we may just refer it to the Jake, who had been the central character in the novel, and when he just got to know about his own inner self, and he just wanted to have the satisfaction in the life, and he just found out the resolution, and he just came to know that he just made a promise or compromise, and he just made this promise with his own self that he might be able to have the satisfaction in his own life. And because he was just in quest of the love, but when he just came to know about the reality, he just compromised about that, and after that he got satisfied. And on the other hand, if you are not able to know about your own identity, you do not know about the world within your own self, then just like the lady Ashley Brett, you might be just wandering over here and there, and from one corner to the other corner of the world in order to get the happiness in the life. But this struggle, it will remain continual during the whole life. So this is more important that we just as an individual just come to know about the reality, that who we are, what is our own identity, and what is that world which is over there in our own self. Concept of nada, it is the word which is Spanish, and its meaning is nothing. And we may say that it is absolute, and it is so huge, and it is terrible, overbearing, but it is omnipresence as well. Actually, it tells and represents the author's understanding of nihilism, and the belief that life is without objective meaning. And we may say that for Hemingway, man is born into a completely naturalistic and totally indifferent universe, a universe without supernatural sanction, and thus without purpose, order, meaning, or value. So this nada, or nothing, then focuses on man's confrontation with the absence of God, the indifference and seeming hostility of the universe, and thus with the absence of purpose, order, meaning, and value in the universe and in the human life. After the First World War, some of American people and writers, they were left disenchanted, and a group of the writers and thinkers chose to live abroad. This time, America desired a kind of the literature they would clarify the war events and its effects on their society. American authors applied what is at present recognized as modernism. Realism and modernism portrayed American society after World War I and tried to find the solutions brought upon by the suffering formed by the war. And in the same manner, Hemingway also emphasizes a sense of disillusionment about the life. And just like other modernist writers, Hemingway had seen the horrors of the war in the works, and his works also reflected a sense that the life was not going to live up to its promise and the promises of the past, such as the idea that fate would be rewarded. And recently, there was no chance to be rewarded, and they were no longer true.